I just opened my mailbox and found my own obituary inside. It's dated 3 years from today, 2029. Every detail about my life is correct, except the part where it says I'm already dead. The morning it happened was the kind of morning that tricks you into feeling safe. The sky was that particular shade of gray that comes before real rain, the air thick with the smell of wet concrete and rotting leaves. I remember pulling my jacket tighter across my chest as I walked down the narrow path from my front door to the letterbox at the end of the garden. The gate had been rusting for 2 years. I kept meaning to oil the hinges. I never did. That morning, the squeal of it cut through the quiet street like something being hurt, and I remember thinking, absently, that I really needed to fix it before winter set in properly. The letterbox itself was in a state. The red paint had long since surrendered to the weather, leaving behind a pitted orange-brown shell that bled rust stains down the concrete post every time it rained. The little flag on the side, the one that's supposed to indicate outgoing mail, had snapped off years ago, leaving just a rusted stub. I barely registered any of this as I reached inside. It was habit, pure muscle memory. Reach in, pull out, flip through, discard the takeaway menus, stack the bills on the kitchen counter, forget about them until the red letters arrive. My fingers closed around a single envelope. No takeaway menus, no bills, just the one envelope. And the moment I pulled it free, something in my body reacted before my mind caught up. My hand slowed. The fine hairs on my forearm prickled upright. The envelope was wrong in a way I couldn't immediately name. It was the color of old teeth, not white, not cream, but something between the two, something that suggested age in the way that a stain suggests damage. The paper was thicker than standard postal envelopes, almost waxy to the touch, and the surface had that faint, rippled texture you find on documents that have been damp and then dried, over and over, as though the thing had cycled through years of weather. Yet the flap was still sealed. The envelope had not been opened. My name was on the front. Not printed, typed, on a typewriter from the look of it, with that slightly uneven pressure that digital fonts cannot replicate, where certain letters press deeper than others, leaving ghost impressions on the back of the page. There was no return address, no postage stamp, nothing to indicate how it had arrived, who had placed it there, or when. The letterbox had no lock. Anyone could have slipped something inside at any point during the previous night, and I would have had no way of knowing. I stood at the end of the garden for a long moment, holding it. I told myself it was a novelty item, a friend's idea of dark humor. My birthday had passed 2 months earlier, and there had been a running joke among a few people I knew about getting older, about the years collapsing in on themselves, about how quickly time was moving. I told myself this was an extension of that joke, delivered late, left anonymously in the box by someone who thought they were being clever. I almost convinced myself. Almost. I opened it at the kitchen table with a butter knife, careful not to tear the envelope, though I couldn't have told you why I was being careful. Inside was a single folded sheet of the same yellowed paper, printed in a 2-column newspaper format that you simply do not see in local publications anymore. The tight, formal typesetting of mid-century broadsheets, the kind of layout that carries with it the weight of institutional authority. The masthead at the top read, "The Harrowfield Gazette," a name I recognized as the local paper that had served this area for decades. But the date beneath the masthead was wrong. The date was impossible. March 14th, 2029. My eyes found my name before my brain gave them permission to look for it. It was in bold, in a slightly larger font than the surrounding text, the way names appear in obituary columns. Below it, in italics, "Beloved resident of Harrowfield, survived by," and then it listed people I know, people who are alive right now. The phrasing around their names was past tense, the language of loss, the language you use to describe those left behind when someone is already gone. I put the paper down. I picked it up again. I read it from the beginning. The cause of death stopped me cold. It wasn't violence. It wasn't an accident. It was listed in the clipped clinical language of medical reporting as complications arising from a progressive cardiac condition, specifically an undiagnosed issue with the left ventricle that had apparently been present for some time before the fatal event. The text described symptoms that had been reported by the deceased in the years prior, but never formally investigated. It used a phrase that hit me like cold water, "a known irregularity left unaddressed." Because there is an irregularity. There has been one for 8 months, a heaviness in my chest that appears without warning and dissolves before I can decide whether it's serious, a rhythm that occasionally skips a beat in a way that feels like a sentence interrupted. My GP had mentioned at my last checkup that it warranted further investigation. I had nodded. I had agreed. I had not booked the follow-up appointment. Life had intervened, as life does, filling the space where the appointment should have been with smaller, louder urgencies. The obituary knew about the irregularity. It described the symptom pattern with a precision that no outsider could reasonably possess. It named the ventricle. It described the specific nature of the eventual failure in language that was clearly medical, clearly informed, clearly drawn from somewhere beyond general knowledge. And it placed the death 3 years from the morning I was reading it, in a month I was currently standing outside of by exactly 1,095 days. I sat with that number for a while. The paper itself troubled me as much as the content. When I held it to the kitchen light, the grain of it was visible. It was not laser printed on standard paper stock. The texture was consistent with letterpress printing, the kind that leaves a faint relief impression on the reverse side of the sheet where the type has pressed into the fibers. This is not how local newspapers are printed. This is not how anything is printed anymore. The process is expensive, slow, and largely obsolete. To produce a single fake sheet using genuine letterpress technology would require access to equipment that most museums no longer keep in operational condition. I photographed every centimeter of it. The envelope, the sheet, the fold lines, the typeface, the masthead, the specific weight and color of the paper. I zoomed in on the ink until I could see the way it had settled into the paper fibers, the slight feathering at the edges of each letter that is characteristic of ink applied under pressure to absorbent stock. Then I zoomed in further, into the text describing the final weeks, into the sentence that listed what had been found beside me when I was discovered, into the name of the person who had found me. It was the name of someone I had not spoken to in 4 years, someone who had moved away, someone whose current address I did not know, someone who had no reason to be in my home, And yet there they were, named as the one who had called the emergency services on the morning of March 14th, 2029, having arrived at my home to find me unresponsive in the hallway. That was the moment the cold fully settled. Not a chill, not the shiver you get from a draft under the door. Something deeper, the kind of cold that lives in the chest, in the space between heartbeats, in the pause before you understand something that cannot be taken back. I set the obituary face down on the kitchen table. I stared at the blank reverse side of the paper. I listened to the rain begin outside. And then I thought about the health appointment I had never booked, the appointment that would confirm what the obituary had already written down, in ink applied by a machine that should not exist, on paper that should not be in my hands, on a date that had not yet arrived. I thought about what it means when the future already has your name in print. And I thought about one more thing, something I had almost missed in my first pass through the document, buried in the final paragraph, in the smallest type on the page, in a corner of the column that had been folded inward so that you would not see it unless you deliberately unfolded the sheet all the way and held it flat. A small, square, black and white symbol, a pattern of dots and squares, precise and deliberate, printed with the same letterpress care as the rest of the document. A QR code. In an obituary dated 2029, printed on technology before the digital age, there was a QR code waiting for me. I did not scan it, not yet, because something told me, the same instinct that makes you pause at the top of a dark staircase, the same animal sense that knows the difference between a sound the house makes and a sound something inside the house makes, that scanning it would be a door I could not walk back through. But I knew I would scan it eventually. The document was designed to be found, designed to be read, designed to bring me to that exact moment of hesitation at the edge of whatever came next. The question I couldn't shake, the one that followed me out of the kitchen and up the stairs and into the bathroom where I stood gripping the sink and staring at my own reflection for a very long time, was not whether the obituary was real. The question was who had written it, and whether they wanted me to live past 2029, or whether the document in my kitchen was not a warning at all, whether it was an instruction. Sleep did not come easily that night. I lay in the dark listening to the rain work its way through the old guttering above the bedroom window, that familiar drip and gurgle that I had always found vaguely comforting, the sound of a house that is old but still standing, still keeping the weather out. That night it sounded different. Everything sounded different. The house had the quality of a held breath, and every creak of the floorboards, every contraction of wood responding to the drop in temperature, felt like a footstep being carefully placed. I had put the obituary in a plastic document sleeve and set it on the corner of my desk. I did not want it loose. I did not want to touch it more than necessary. The sleeve was a compromise between needing to keep it and not wanting it to be too present, too available, too close to me in the dark. I could see it from the doorway of the bedroom if I left the door ajar. I checked twice that I could see it. The second time I checked, I was not sure whether I was making sure it was still there or making sure it hadn't moved. By 5 in the morning, I had given up on sleep entirely. I made coffee and sat with my laptop at the kitchen table and started with the most rational place I could think of, the Harrowfield Gazette itself. The Gazette had been publishing for over 100 years. Its archives were partially digitized, accessible through the regional library's online portal, and covered the publication's history from its founding in 1902 through to its transition to digital-only distribution in 2018, at which point it had abandoned print entirely. The physical paper, the broadsheet version, the one with the two-column layout and the dense, formal typesetting, had ceased production years before the supposed date on the document in my sleeve. The masthead design on my obituary matched the pre-2018 broadsheet format almost exactly, but with subtle differences in the font weight of the title letters that I could not immediately explain. The version I was looking at matched no specific edition I could locate in the archive. I made a note, photographed the comparison on my phone. Then I started looking into the printing technology. Letterpress printing, the process that produces the kind of relief impression I had observed on the reverse of the sheet, had a specific resurgence in the craft community during the 2010s, used primarily for wedding stationery and limited edition art prints. There were perhaps a dozen small operations within a 50-mile radius that maintained working letterpress equipment. I wrote down every name I could find. I would need to contact each of them. But first, I needed something more concrete than my own assessment of the print quality. I needed someone whose professional opinion would be harder to dismiss. The forensic document examiner I eventually reached was a woman named Dr. Petra Voss, who had spent 20 years working with legal firms and insurance companies on cases involving questioned documents, forged wills, tampered contracts, fraudulent correspondence. She agreed to see me 2 days later in a consulting office above a solicitor's firm in the town center. I drove there with the obituary sealed in an archival envelope inside a rigid cardboard folder inside a bag, handling it like something that might detonate. Dr. Voss was precise in the way that people become precise when their entire professional life has been spent distinguishing between things that most people would consider identical. She wore magnifying glasses on a lanyard around her neck and examined the document first with the naked eye, then under a handheld loupe, then under a mounted magnifier with an integrated light source that illuminated the fiber filaments and the ink distribution in high relief. She did not speak while she worked. She made occasional small sounds, exhaled breaths, a short click of the tongue that conveyed assessment without words. When she finally looked up, she set her loupe on the desk and interlaced her fingers. The paper is old, not antique, but not recently manufactured. I would estimate the stock itself is between 15 and 25 years old, based on the yellowing pattern and the fiber degradation I'm seeing. That's not definitive without chemical testing, but it's consistent. She paused. The ink, however, is more recent. The solvents haven't fully completed their off-gassing process. If this were printed years ago and stored, the ink chemistry would reflect that. This ink is at most months old, possibly weeks. I asked her what that meant. It means someone sourced old paper stock, either from archive supplies or from a decommissioned print operation, and used it as the substrate for a very recent print run. She looked back at the document. The letterpress impression is genuine. This wasn't laser printed and then embossed artificially. I can tell by the ink distribution in the relief valleys. Real letterpress, real equipment. She paused again, longer this time. Someone put considerable effort into this. I asked whether the content had registered with her at all, whether she had read what was printed on the page. She looked at me steadily. I noticed the name, yes. I noticed the date. She did not elaborate. She was a professional, but something in the set of her expression told me that she had noticed more than that, and that she had chosen, deliberately, not to say it. I thanked her and left. On the pavement outside, in the thin November light, I stood still for a moment and processed what she had told me. Old paper, new ink, genuine equipment. Someone had constructed the document recently, using materials and methods that were deliberately chosen to create the impression of age and institutional legitimacy. This was not a spontaneous prank. This was planned. This was built. That was the moment the investigation stopped feeling like a puzzle and started feeling like a pursuit. I went to the local newspaper offices next, the digital-only successor to the Gazette, operating from a small commercial unit on the edge of the industrial estate. A young editor named Callum received me with the polite wariness of someone who encounters eccentric members of the public more often than you would like. I showed him the document. I watched his expression move through skepticism, curiosity, and something that was not quite either. He turned the sheet over. He examined the masthead. He pulled up his own archive on a desktop monitor and compared the fonts side by side. "This isn't our format," he said. "Not current, not historical. Look at the kerning on the title letters. We've never used that exact spacing. Someone has approximated our layout very well, but this is not a Gazette document." He looked at me. "You should know you're not the first person to come to us with something like this." I asked him to say that again. He leaned back in his chair. "In the past 6 weeks, I've had 3 other people bring in documents that claim to be future editions of local publications. Different formats, different mastheads. One from a person in the Avery Road area, one from a woman over near the waterworks, one from a retired teacher who lives up on the Hill estate." He folded his hands. "All of them found the documents in their letterboxes. All of them said there were no stamps, no postmarks. All of them said the content was personal, specifically personal." I felt the floor shift slightly beneath me. Not metaphorically. A genuine physical sensation of something losing its solidity. I asked him if he had seen the content of those other documents. Pieces of it, enough to know they weren't jokes. He hesitated. The woman near the waterworks, her document described her husband's death in a car accident on a specific road at a specific time. Her husband travels that road every Thursday. He started taking a different route. He looked at me with something I recognized after a moment as controlled fear. She asked me if he thought that would change things, if avoiding the road would be enough. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through streets I knew well, watching the familiar landmarks of the neighborhood as though seeing them for the first time. The rusted gate, the cracked pavement outside the newsagent, the oak tree at the corner of my road whose roots had buckled the footpath into a series of uneven ridges. All of it looked the same. All of it felt altered, as though a transparency had been laid over the present, a second image, slightly offset, showing a version of these same streets 3 years from now, when someone would walk them without me. 4 people in the same neighborhood, 4 documents, 4 impossible, specific, intimate portraits of deaths that had not yet happened. Someone was watching this neighborhood very carefully, and they had decided, for reasons I could not yet see, to let us know what they knew. I began cataloging the details of the obituary with the methodical determination of someone who has decided that understanding something, however terrible, is preferable to not understanding it. I printed the photograph I'd taken of the document at the highest resolution my printer could manage, taped it to a blank section of wall in my spare room, and began annotating it with sticky notes. Pink for verified facts, yellow for unverified claims, blue for elements that required further investigation. Within 2 days, the wall looked like the working surface of a conspiracy, which I recognized with grim awareness was precisely what it had become. The clinical details were the ones that unsettled me most deeply, because they were the ones most resistant to dismissal. The obituary described in restrained but precise language the circumstances of the final days. It mentioned a specific pharmaceutical compound, one I had to search online to even identify, that had apparently been administered during a hospitalization in the week before the listed date. The compound's name meant nothing to me until I cross-referenced it, at which point I discovered something that made me sit back from the screen and press my palms flat against the desk. The compound in question was in Phase 3 clinical trials as of the time I was reading this. It had not received regulatory approval. It was not yet available for general prescription. The obituary described it being used in a standard clinical context as though it were a routine medication, as though in 2029 its approval would be so established that it would require no particular comment. This was not something a person could fabricate through general research. To know the name of a compound still in trials and then project forward to a future in which it had been approved and integrated into standard treatment protocols, that required either extraordinary luck, extraordinary knowledge, or access to information that was not publicly available. I wrote clinical trial compound, Phase 3, not yet approved, on a blue note and pinned it to the wall. The obituary also referenced a specific diagnostic technology used in identifying the cardiac event's cause. The description was brief but technically precise, and the technology it described bore no relationship to any imaging or diagnostic process I could find in current medical literature. It sounded like an extrapolation, a natural development from existing cardiac imaging technology, but pushed further, refined past the current frontier. I showed the description, stripped of all identifying context, to a contact I had with a background in medical research. She read it carefully. She told me it described something theoretically plausible, a logical next step in a specific branch of cardiac diagnostics, but that nothing matching the description was currently in development anywhere she was aware of. "Where did you read this?" she asked. I told her I had found it in a document. I did not tell her where. She accepted this with the patient skepticism of someone accustomed to non-answers and moved on. The survivors listed in the obituary were the element I had been putting off examining. I had read them in the first moments of discovery and then turned away from them, the way you look away from an injury before the adrenaline has worn off. Now I made myself look. The names were real. They were people I knew. The relational descriptors beside each name, the phrases like dear friend and cherished colleague, matched the actual quality of those relationships with an accuracy that felt invasive, as though the document had access not to public records, but to something more intimate, the texture of my actual life, the specific weight of specific bonds, rendered in the clipped vocabulary of memorial language. One name stopped me. Among the listed survivors was someone I had met only twice at a community event, briefly, in conversations I would have considered superficial. We had exchanged contact details but rarely communicated. The obituary listed this person with the descriptor trusted confidant. We were not confidants. We were barely acquaintances. Unless something was going to change between now and 2029 that would draw us together in a way I could not currently predict. The document was not just describing who I was, it was describing who I was going to be. I turned my attention to the newspaper listed on the masthead, specifically to the address of the editorial offices printed in the fine text at the base of the column. The address given was a street in the older part of town, a road I knew. I drove past it that afternoon. The building at the listed address was a dry cleaner's, a long-established one, occupying the ground floor of a Victorian terrace. I went inside and asked as casually as I could how long they had been operating from that location. The woman behind the counter told me 37 years. I called the Gazette's current digital editorial line and asked whether the paper had ever operated from that address. There was a pause, the sound of someone consulting records, and then, no. The Gazette had operated from 3 different addresses over its history, none of which was the address listed on my document. The address on the obituary did not belong to any real publication, past or present. It had been invented. But it had been invented convincingly, slotted into the document's bureaucratic furniture with the same care as everything else, designed to look like an institutional detail that no one would think to question. I thought about the other 3 people in the neighborhood. I thought about the woman whose husband had changed his Thursday route. I thought about what it meant that 4 documents had been delivered to 4 people in the same area, all constructed with this level of deliberate craft, all containing this quality of intimate, specific, impossible knowledge. Then I thought about something I had not yet addressed, the question of why. Not how, not who, why. What was the purpose of sending a person their own death notice 3 years early? The most charitable interpretation was a warning, some elaborate theatrical attempt to prompt a course correction in someone's life. Stop ignoring the cardiac symptoms, book the appointment, change the outcome. In this reading, the document was a gift, however grotesque its wrapping. The least charitable interpretation was control, the deliberate installation of a countdown in someone's psychology, a mechanism for steering behavior through the manipulation of fear. If you tell someone they will die at a specific time in a specific way, you do not just inform them, you colonize them. You take up residence in every decision they make for the next 3 years, whispering from the corner of every room. I kept returning to the name of the person who had found me, the acquaintance I had barely spoken to. Their presence in the document implied a future I had not yet built, a relationship I had not yet formed. If the obituary was predictive rather than constructed, then the relationship would develop naturally, without intervention, and I would arrive at 2029 having grown close to someone I currently barely knew. If the obituary was constructed, designed to be self-fulfilling, then reading their name in this context might cause me to reach out to them, to cultivate the relationship, to create the circumstance that the document had already described, not discovering the future, building it, one anxious decision at a time, following a blueprint I had been handed by an unknown architect. I stood in the spare room looking at the annotated wall, pink notes, yellow notes, blue notes, the photograph of the obituary at the center of it all. And then, in the quiet of the house, in the particular silence that comes when you have been alone with something frightening for long enough that the fear has begun to feel like furniture, I made a decision. The digital path was the one I had been avoiding. The paper trail was exhausted. The forensic analysis had confirmed construction without explaining origin. The neighborhood pattern pointed to an organized effort rather than an individual. The next step was underneath the surface of things, in the places where the internet's public face ends and something older, darker, and less regulated begins. I was going to find out who had built this document, and something told me that the QR code and whatever lived behind it was the only door that led to that answer. The dark web has a specific quality that is difficult to communicate to someone who has not spent time in it. Not the lurid, cinematic darkness of crime thrillers, but something quieter and more unsettling. It feels like walking through the back corridors of a building that was designed to confuse, rooms that shouldn't connect to each other, doors that open onto other doors, the persistent sense that the architecture is not accidental but deliberate, designed by someone who wanted navigation to be difficult. I had a contact, a person I will call only by the handle they used in our communications, Rendell, who had assisted with digital investigations before and who agreed, reluctantly, to help me trace the footprint of whoever had built the obituary. Before I gave Rendell access to anything, I made myself scan the QR code. I did it standing in the middle of my kitchen, in full daylight, with every light in the house switched on, which I am aware does not constitute meaningful protection against digital threat, but which made me feel marginally less exposed. I pointed my phone camera at the code and waited. The URL it resolved to was a string of randomized characters. No domain name, no identifying information, routing through layers of obfuscation that suggested deliberate anonymization. The page it opened was stripped back to near nothing. A white background, no images, no branding, no text except a single line of numbers displayed in a large, clean font. It was a timer, counting down. Days, hours, minutes, seconds, all moving with mechanical precision toward a specific terminal point. I did not need to calculate the end point. The document in my plastic sleeve had already told me what date the counter was approaching. March 14th, 2029. The timer agreed. The timer was currently sitting at approximately 1,093 days, give or take a handful of hours. I screenshotted it, sent it to Rendell. Then I closed the browser and stood very still in my bright kitchen for a while. Rendell came back to me within 48 hours. What they had found required 2 phone calls to fully explain, and even then I found myself asking them to repeat certain things because the implications were too large to absorb on first contact. The URL was hosted on infrastructure that had been specifically constructed to be difficult to trace. Multiple jurisdictions, multiple relay layers, no commercial hosting provider. It had been operational for longer than I had been in possession of the obituary, which meant it had been set up in advance of the document's arrival. Someone had built the countdown before delivering the document that pointed to it. This was not reactive. This was staged. Every element had been prepared, ordered, and deployed as part of a sequence. And then Rendell told me about the forum. It existed on a .onion address, hidden, accessible only through specialized browsers, indexed nowhere. Its interface was minimal, its membership anonymous, but its content was specific and consistent and deeply disturbing. The forum was populated by people who had received documents similar to mine, not identical in format, but equivalent in nature. Predated documents, personalized, clinically detailed, containing information that should not be accessible to any outsider. The posts were written in a range of languages. The contributors were geographically dispersed, not clustered, as I had assumed, around a single neighborhood or region, but distributed internationally across dozens of countries. I read through as many posts as I could access. The experiences described were eerily consistent. Documents arrived without postage. Documents contained accurate personal details that no public record could account for. Documents described deaths via causes that resonated with known but unaddressed health concerns. Documents referenced people, places, and technologies in ways that were simultaneously specific and slightly ahead of the present, as though the author had access to a reliable model of each recipient's future trajectory. One thread in particular stopped me cold. A user had mapped the timeline of their document's predictions against subsequent real-world events, not the death itself, which had not yet occurred, but the smaller details embedded in the surrounding text, incidental references to job changes, relationship endings, minor accidents. The user reported that 6 of the 9 incidental details they had tracked had already come true in the precise form described, despite the document's supposed origin in a future that had not yet arrived. They had written, "I am not reading about my future, I am watching it execute." Another user had done something I had not considered. They had searched for the names of the supposed authors listed in the fine print of their document, the editorial credits, the typesetter's name, the small bureaucratic personnel that real publications include as a matter of course. They had found that some of these names corresponded to real people, not public figures, not easily searchable individuals, but ordinary people living ordinary lives in nowhere near the recipient. People who, when contacted, had no knowledge of any document or publication. People who were, in some cases, themselves recipients. The architecture was recursive. The people named inside the documents were also being documented. The web of it extended outward from every recipient, incorporating their listed survivors, their named contacts, their documented relationships into a network of interlocking futures that all converged on the same underlying structure. Rendell had attempted to trace the forum's administration and had reached a wall, not a technical wall, but something stranger. Every trail that should have led to an individual server or administrator instead looped back through the same relay cluster, passing through infrastructure registered to a holding company that existed in legal terms but had no officers, no physical address, no operational footprint beyond the registration documents themselves. The company name translated from the language in which it was originally registered as something that Rendell initially rendered as archival services, but which on closer examination was more precisely translated as the recording of what has already happened. I sat with that translation for a long time, because it implied something that the rational part of my mind kept trying to push away. Not that someone was predicting the future, not that someone was constructing the future by planting self-fulfilling documents in people's letterboxes, but something else entirely, something that inverted the sequence of events in a way that made the architecture of the whole thing suddenly, horribly coherent. What if the documents were not being sent from the present into a possible future? What if they were being sent from a fixed future into the past? What if whoever or whatever was responsible for the documents existed at a point in time after the deaths they had documented and was transmitting that documentation backward to the people who would die for reasons that the recipients could not yet understand? I knew how it sounded. I knew what any reasonable person would say in response to that hypothesis, but the evidence I was sitting with did not fit any alternative. The clinical precision, the knowledge of unpublished pharmaceutical compounds, the descriptions of diagnostic technology that did not yet exist, the countdown timer that had been operational before the document arrived, The forum, populated by people across the world, in cultures with no shared connection, all receiving the same category of impossible, intimate communication. I pinned a final note to the spare room wall. Not pink, yellow, or blue. Black. They already know how this ends. The question is what they want from the time between. There is a particular kind of mourning that comes after a long investigation, after the notebooks have filled up and the wall is covered, and the calls have all been made, and the interviews have all been conducted, and you have arrived, finally, at the edge of what can be known through ordinary means. It is a morning that looks exactly like every other morning, with the same light coming through the same windows, the same sounds from the street outside. But you move through it differently, more carefully, with the constant low awareness of someone who knows that the ground they are walking on has a shape to it, a particular topography that they did not understand before. I booked the cardiac appointment. I want to say that clearly and early because I think it matters more than almost anything else I could report about the aftermath. Whatever the obituary was, warning, manipulation, transmission from some unthinkable future point, the one thing it had done, undeniably, was insert a piece of information I had been avoiding into a position where I could no longer avoid it. The irregularity in my chest was real. It had been real for months. I had known it was real, and I had chosen repeatedly not to act on that knowledge. The obituary had made the cost of that choice visible. So I called the clinic. I gave my name. I was given a date, and I wrote it in my calendar in ink, and I did not allow myself to move it. The cardiologist I saw was thorough and unhurried. She ran tests over 2 appointments and found what she found, which I will not describe in full detail, except to say that the obituary's clinical language had been more accurate than any guesswork had any right to be. There was something there, something addressable, something that caught at this stage could be managed, could be monitored, could be treated before it progressed to the stage that the document had described. She told me I was fortunate to have come in when I had. She asked what had prompted me, after a significant gap in my checkup history, to suddenly prioritize it. I told her something had brought it to my attention. She nodded and made a note. She did not ask me to elaborate. I left the clinic and sat in my car for a long time, not crying exactly, but something adjacent to it, the release of a pressure that had been building for weeks. If the obituary had been designed to prevent my death, it was working. If it had been designed to steer me toward it, then whoever was steering had miscalculated, because the document that was supposed to describe an unaddressed cardiac condition had instead prompted me to address it. Or, and this was the thought I could not fully dismiss, the treatment was already part of it, already written into the 2029 timeline. The appointment, the diagnosis, the medication, the years of managed condition leading eventually, despite everything, to the March morning I had been promised. The act of trying to escape the document might itself be one of the documented steps. I went back to the forum. I posted for the first time rather than just reading. I described my situation in general terms: the letterbox, the obituary, the cardiac finding, the appointment. I asked whether anyone else had attempted to act against the content of their document and whether they believed it had made a difference. The responses came in over the following days. They came from people in different time zones, different circumstances, different stages of their own investigations. Some had tried to avoid the predicted causes of death, changing habits, changing routes, changing relationships. Some reported apparent success, events that seemed to deviate from the documented path. Others reported the opposite, that every attempt to avoid had led them by a different route back toward the very outcome they were trying to prevent. One user put it this way, and the phrasing has stayed with me since I read it. I drove 40 miles to avoid a junction and found the same junction waiting at the other end of the detour. There was a user on the forum who had been there longer than anyone else. Their post history went back farther than the forum's apparent public existence, which Rendell told me was itself technically impossible, and implied that either their account had been seeded into the forum's history retroactively, or the forum had existed in a form not accessible to standard navigation for much longer than anyone realized. This user had never described their own document. They only ever responded to others, briefly, in language that was always precise and always slightly oblique. Their responses suggested knowledge that went beyond what any other participant had shared. I sent this user a private message. They responded within minutes, which, given the anonymized architecture of the forum, should not have been possible without someone actively monitoring at that exact moment. The message was short. It said, "The documents are not predictions. They are not warnings. They are records. They were created after the events they describe. The question you should be asking is not whether the future can be changed. The question is why, if the future is fixed, the records were sent back to the people they concern. What function does a record serve if the outcome cannot be altered?" I read it 3 times. Then I typed back, "What function?" Their reply took longer. When it came, it was 2 sentences. Consider what a person does differently when they know they are being observed. Consider whether that difference is the point. I did not receive another message from them. The account showed no further activity. Rendell, when I asked them to look into the account's history and technical footprint, found nothing. No access logs, no IP traces, no origin data of any kind. The account existed in the forum's records, but had left no trace of ever having connected. I spent the weeks after that living with the question they had posed. What does a person do differently when they know they are being observed? The answer, I found, was more significant than I had expected. I made different decisions, small ones and larger ones. I called people I had been putting off calling. I repaired relationships that had been quietly eroding. I paid attention to things I had been letting slide, not just the cardiac appointment, but the texture of days, the quality of the time I was spending, and with whom. I fixed the gate. I oiled the hinges. The squeal stopped. I do not know whether any of this will change the date on the obituary. I do not know whether the countdown timer is still running. I have not gone back to the URL. I am not sure I want to know how many days remain on the clock. The number feels like it would do more harm than good, would install itself in my peripheral vision and pull focus from the thing it is counting down toward, which is my life, which is happening now, which is the only material I have to work with. What I know is this: the document arrived with a specific intention, whether that intention was human or something I cannot categorize. It arrived with specific knowledge, whether that knowledge was investigative or something I cannot explain. It arrived with a specific effect on my behavior, and that effect has been, so far, to make me more alive in the years before the date it named, more deliberate, more present, more conscious of the gap between what I intend to do and what I actually do. Maybe that is the architecture. Maybe that is the design. A record sent backward not to warn you, not to control you, but to wake you up inside the years you would otherwise sleepwalk through, to give you the specific, cold, clarifying knowledge that the time is finite and the number attached to that finitude is already written down somewhere in ink pressed into old paper by a machine that shouldn't exist, sitting in someone's archive in a future you have not yet reached. The obituary is still in its plastic sleeve. It is still pinned to the wall in the spare room alongside all the notes and photographs and traces of the investigation that produced no final answer, only better questions. I look at it sometimes, not with the same horror I felt in the first days, but with something more complicated, something like respect maybe, for whatever it is, for whatever it knows. The gate no longer squeals. The cardiac medication sits on the kitchen counter beside the coffee maker, part of the morning routine now, as ordinary as anything. The person named in the obituary as the one who would find me, the barely known acquaintance who would somehow become a trusted confidant, and I have been talking more. I did not engineer it. It happened the way things happen when you stop filling your days so completely that there is no room for anything unexpected. There is space now. I made space. Whether any of this will matter in 2029, I genuinely cannot tell you. What I can tell you is that somewhere in a future that has already written my name in its records, there is a version of events, a documented outcome, a clinical description of a final morning. And between now and then, there is everything else. The question that stays with me, the one I carry into each new day, into the small decisions that accumulate into a life, is the one I cannot answer and cannot stop asking. Am I reading my destiny? Or is something out there, patient and precise and invisible, reading mine?